All right, so for this installment today, we're going to be looking more specifically at the different types of characterization in fiction and answering the question, how do authors create memorable characters? So getting into a little bit more detail about the characters themselves, because as I say, it's very important to know how to break down a story, but in order to do that, you have to know where to start. So what are you going to analyze? The most critical thing to analyze is the main character and the main character's actions. And the antagonist will come into play, and the conflict and all of that will come into play. So the characters and conflicts are what drives the story, what drives the plot. We'll get into plot a little bit later on in the series, but for today, let's focus on a little bit deeper dive into characterization. So characterization in fiction is what I want to discuss here briefly at this time. How do authors create memorable characters? So you think about a character or a pair of characters such as Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. So I'm a teacher, and I work in a high school, and I work with grades 9 through 12. And of course, everybody's heard of Romeo and Juliet. Whoever comes into my classroom has already heard of Romeo and Juliet. Maybe they've seen the movie Romeo and Juliet with Leonardo DiCaprio at some point in the past. But generally, they are familiar with the story of Romeo and Juliet before they ever get into high school. So how is that possible? Okay? Romeo and Juliet are such iconic characters that I, sometimes show a little PowerPoint about these characters in fiction, and I show a photographic still from the original Romeo and Juliet from the 1960s, the film, I think, Franco Zeffirelli, if I'm not mistaken. In any case, I just put the picture on the screen without having identified the characters as Romeo and Juliet, and it takes them about 2 seconds to realize this is a picture of Romeo and Juliet. So Romeo and Juliet was written more than 400 years ago, back in the late 16th century. So 400 years later, we still know Romeo and Juliet. Why is that the case? How is it possible that Shakespeare created such memorable characters? Well, it's no secret that Shakespeare was one of the greatest writers of all time. But in general, how do authors create memorable characters? Well, there are ways that they can present a character in terms of the character's appearance. There are oftentimes stories which contain a very detailed description of the character's appearance. We have the character's speech. All right, how does the character talk? In what kind of way does the character talk? Does the character talk in an educated way? Do they talk in a non-educated way? Do they use a lot of street language? Do they use a lot of profanity? Do they use a lot of five-letter words, four-letter words, five-syllable words? Do they talk like they're a walking dictionary? Very, highbrow, highly educated. The way a character talks not only reveals something about themselves, but when they are talking to other people, how do they talk to other people? Are they rude? Are they obnoxious? Are they polite? Are they well-mannered? Does their speech change when they talk to a certain type of person versus another type of person? This can all reveal things about the character himself or herself. The character's actions, of course. And in a story, we always have to figure out what is the character trying to do, and then how do they go about doing it. So the character's actions can reveal a lot about the character himself or herself. Not only by what they do, but how do they do it. So again, how do they treat other people? How do they respond to other people? How do they react to other people? In what way are they friendly? Are they rude? Are they respectful? Are they disrespectful to others? If a character, for example, has a lot of racial prejudice and is represented, in stories from the times of segregation in the Deep South, for example, the character's actions would belie their racism because they would treat other white people respectfully, perhaps, but they would treat the African American people very disrespectfully and very harshly. So that also gets into what is this fourth one here, the character's beliefs. How do the character's beliefs show something about that person's characters? What do they believe? So racial prejudice, for example, a very common theme in literature, fiction, of course, throughout the decades of the 20th century and into the 21st century, of course. Prejudice is a belief, okay? It's an opinion. It's a state of mind. So if a character is harboring a lot of racial prejudice, this is something that they believe to be true. That in some way, whatever race they are is in some way superior and that another person's race is in some way inferior, and therefore they have a right and they have the justification to attack the other person, to put down the other person, or to intimidate the other person, discriminate against the other person. So I always tell students that prejudice is more of a belief. Prejudice is more of an opinion, a negative opinion about somebody else's race, somebody else's religion, somebody else's way of life, which is different from yours. But then discrimination is more of an action, because you're actually crossing over the line from thought into action. So if a character is very prejudiced and very racist in his or her ideas, that then leads into actions which would be more discrimination or discriminatory actions. So I tell students, it's not a crime in this country for someone to hang up a Confederate flag outside their house, okay? Because that represents a person's particular opinion about the Confederacy and slavery and all of the issues involved with that. They have a right to hang out whatever flag they want to hang out in front of their yard. But if they go burn a cross in front of somebody's house that is not their house, that's discrimination. That's what would be, generally classified as a hate crime, and rightfully so. So a lot of the stories that you'll see, you can hear the way the character talks, you can see what they do, you can, through the narrator's point of view, you can get an idea of their beliefs. And the final one about how to develop these well-rounded characters is by what others say about the character. So if I was to show a picture of a person, just a random individual person, and I say, okay, to my students, look at this picture. Okay, they could tell me a little bit about the person based on what they see in the photograph, right? They could tell me, does the person wear glasses? Okay, that's part of the character's appearance. Is the person's skin color light or dark? Okay, that's part of the appearance. Eye color, hair color, okay? Maybe the kind of clothes that they're wearing describes something about their character. Maybe they're wearing a t-shirt with a peace sign on it. Okay, that also reveals something about their character. What do they think is important in their lives? Maybe they have certain types of jewelry, like they're wearing a necklace with a cross on it. That's a very clear indication of a character's beliefs. Maybe they're, wearing earrings of a particular type. Maybe they have rings on their fingers with, specific class rings, for example, or other designs, insignias on their rings. Everything can be revealed about a person's appearance through a photograph, but that doesn't tell the whole story, right? So when we talk about how authors create memorable characters, the more of these things that they can include in the characterization of a particular, let's say, protagonist, the better we will remember that person. Just the same way if I flash 100 photographs, you may be able to identify 10 of them afterwards, but it doesn't really tell you much about it. It's only the surface, okay? We got to go deeper than the surface. So just the character's appearance will get some indication of the person's character, but by diving in deeper, looking at the speech, looking at the actions, looking at their beliefs, and then finally what other people say about the character. Because it's very commonly known that a person may show one face to one type of person, but then show a completely different face to another person. So if I was to say, okay, what do you think about this person, Mr. X? And the person knows Mr. X, so he gives me a description, and the description is favorable. Well, maybe he's a friend of Mr. X, so he doesn't want to say anything bad about Mr. X. But then I go to somebody else who knows Mr. X and has had problems with Mr. X in the past. I say, well, what do you tell me about Mr. X? They're going to give me a completely different picture. They're going to give me a completely different description of Mr. X than the first person. So what do I have to do as a neutral observer is sort of take those two statements of Mr. X's character and decide, the truth may lie somewhere in the middle. But in any case, if an author includes all of these 5 elements in the actual story and in the actual working out of the action in the story, I will be more likely to remember this character, remember this protagonist or antagonist, than if they only gave me 1 or 2. All right, so it's logical to say that the more detail that you put into the description, the more memorable it's going to be. So this gets into the discussion of the terms down here in the corner. If you see the first one, it says round character versus flat character. So what does that mean? Well, you think about the word well-rounded or three-dimensional character. So how do you create a three-dimensional character? Like we just described. The more detail you put in, the more well-rounded the description is. So a round character is some kind of character that is very well developed. So something that would include indications and examples of all of these things here would be found and consistent with a round character. All right? On the other hand, a flat character would be someone in a story, a character in a story, who is not very well developed. Someone we know very little about. Maybe only one thing of these five we know about. Maybe we only know how the character talks. Maybe there's no description of the character's appearance. But in any case, we don't have a very deep understanding of the character if the character is a flat character. Only a very small amount of detail is given, and we are not very familiar with that character. So, a lot of these flat characters would be someone who appears in a story for a very short period of time and then leaves the story and is not seen again. In any case, the flat character is not a highly or deeply developed character. The round character is much more deeply developed. Now, if you look over here, a couple other terms that we need to talk about quickly here, the dynamic character versus the static character. So again, what is a dynamic character? In our first installment yesterday, we talked about how characters change through the course of their experience with the conflict of a story. And this is why the conflict is so important to identify and be able to describe. Because it affects the characters. How does a conflict affect the character? The character is not the same at the beginning. The character is not the same at the end as they were at the beginning. Through the course of the action, through the course of experiencing the conflict, they transform, they change dramatically in the course of the story. So, a very good example of a dynamic character would be, of course, the character Ebenezer Scrooge. All right, Ebenezer Scrooge is another kind of iconic character from Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, right? Ebenezer Scrooge, at the beginning of the Christmas Carol, is a very mean-spirited, cheapskate, miser, treats everybody horribly, hates everything, hates everyone. He is a real miserable character. So, at the beginning of the story, we all know what Ebenezer Scrooge is like. And we do have descriptions that will justify our dislike of him for sure. But then through the course of his experience with the conflict and A Christmas Carol, of course, one of the conflicts would be man or character versus the unknown, because he has these encounters with these three spirits. So, through the course of this conflict or this encounter with this supernatural elements, ghost of Christmas past, ghost of Christmas present, ghost of Christmas future, and of course his encounter with the ghost of his dead partner, Jacob Marley, he goes through a complete and total transformation. So, at the end of the story, he's a completely, totally different person than he was at the beginning. Now he's a nice guy, right? He's generous. He's charitable. He is overflowing with joy and happiness at even the thought of helping Tiny Tim and generally helping humanity. So his character goes through a complete 180-degree transformation. So he would be a very good example of a dynamic character. A static character, on the other hand, would be a character who does not change through the course of a story. The character is the same at the beginning as in the end. And this is the case with a lot of these stage villains, as we call them, in cases where the bad guy is always bad. Right? He's bad at the beginning, he's bad at the middle, he's bad at the end. Or some kind of classic sort of stock character who just is a stereotypical evil guy. So you think a lot of the James Bond stories. All right, they feature villains who are bad at the beginning, bad in the middle, and bad at the end. So generally James Bond saves the day and defeats the bad guy and the villain and all that we know. But looking at the characters of those villains, they're very much the same. They're basically the type of character, they're just someone who wants to take over the world. Right? They don't want to do anything else except conquer the whole world. And that's consistent with probably 95% of the villains in the James Bond movies. They just want to take over the world. So, they don't change. Right? So another, kind of character which would be a static character would be if you look at, the first two installments of the Star Wars stories. Darth Vader is a static character. In the first movie, he's evil. In the second movie, he's evil. But at the end of the third movie, the original trilogy, the third movie was The Return of the Jedi. At the end of The Return of the Jedi, he has a change of heart. So in the end of the third movie, he becomes a dynamic character. But for the first two movies and through 3/4 of the third movie, he's a static character. He's evil. Doesn't change. At the very end of the third installment, The Return of the Jedi, he does change and becomes someone who is transformed. So he becomes a dynamic character in the end, but for the most part, he's a static character. And if you have seen, for example, Rogue One, the Star Wars story, goes back, Darth Vader appears in that installment, he's evil in that one as well. So we associate Darth Vader with an evil character. And that's the reason why we call him a static character. So when you approach a work of literature, or when you're required to write about a work of literature, as I mentioned, a lot of these prompts and a lot of these essay topics require students to analyze character and describe the character. Is the character a protagonist and antagonist? How much do we know about the character? How much is revealed about the character? What do the characters do in the story? What are their motivations? And then if you think about all these things, the appearance, the speech, the actions, the beliefs, if you have what others say about it, if you can describe all of these things in the form of a paragraph or in the form of an essay, really dig deeply into the character's presentation in a short story or in a novel, it will really go far into helping you to analyze the story. So basically that's all for now. We're going to get into how the characters and conflicts are related to plots and how to go about looking at plot and analyzing plot. And then if you look at characters, conflicts, and then the next installment we'll look at the plot and plot developments. So characters, conflicts, and plot, that will lead you into a discussion of the theme of a story. So the theme of the story is really an important concept, but we'll get to plot in the next installment, and then we'll see how plot plus character plus conflict can help you develop an analysis of the theme of a story. So that's all for now. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you again soon.